Sean Diddy Combs just suffered another brutal courtroom defeat, and this time, it wasn't just legal, it was personal. In front of the entire courtroom, the judge basically told him, "Cut the act. We see what you're doing. If you've been following this case, you know Diddy's not fighting this trial like a man trying to clear his name. He's fighting it like a man desperate to stop the system before it catches up to him. And he's not pulling punches. He's allegedly been using insider influence, PR distractions, and now planting a juror. Yes, you heard that right? A juror. But here's the kicker. The man Diddy allegedly slipped onto the jury. Someone who may have been handpicked to help tip the trial in his favor was just thrown off the case. And what followed was chaos. Diddy's legal team freaked out. They accused the court of racial bias, cried foul over judicial discretion, and begged, once again, for a mistrial. But the judge? He shut it down. Completely. So, where does that leave Diddy now? Is this the beginning of the end for his legal tricks? Or does he have more cards to play? Let's break it all down. Because once you see the full picture, you'll realize this wasn't just a bad move. It may have exposed the entire playbook. To understand just how bizarre and potentially explosive this situation with juror number 6 is, we need to rewind to the very beginning of jury selection. In high-profile criminal trials like this one, jury selection is not a formality. It's a war. Both the defense and prosecution know that the composition of the jury can make or break the outcome. Every juror's background, biases, body language, even their job or neighborhood, everything is scrutinized. This isn't just about finding impartial people, it's about predicting who will lean your way under pressure. So imagine the shock when juror number 6, one of the few black male jurors selected, was suddenly removed from the panel mid-trial. No warning, no clear explanation at first. Diddy's supporters immediately jumped in with accusations. Why was he the one removed? Is this another case of a black man being erased from a process that already doesn't represent us? The optics were bad. Very bad. And at first glance, it looked like another strike against fairness in a system already criticized for its bias. But the truth? It flipped that entire narrative on its head. According to court insiders, the reason juror number 6 was removed wasn't because of who he was, but what he did. And what he did was lie. During voir dire, the preliminary questioning of potential jurors, he stated that he lived in the Bronx. On paper, that checked the boxes: Manhattan trial, Bronx resident, eligible to serve. But then something strange happened. He reportedly told a court staff member, not the judge, not under oath, just in passing conversation, that he also lived with his girlfriend in New Jersey. Now, to most people, that might sound trivial. A lot of people have 2 addresses. Maybe he works in the Bronx and crashes in Jersey sometimes. What's the big deal? But here's the legal problem. The law requires jurors to be residents of the jurisdiction where the trial is being held. If a person spends a substantial amount of time living outside that state, or fails to disclose that dual residency, it undermines the integrity of the jury pool. It's not just a technicality, it's a serious breach. It opens the door for bias, misrepresentation, and, worst-case scenario, jury tampering. And when the court began to investigate, it got even murkier. Apparently, juror number 6 had shaded other answers during voir dire. He downplayed parts of his background, gave vague answers to key questions, and never once mentioned the New Jersey address until that one offhand comment. This is where suspicions really started to boil. Why would someone do that? Why would someone risk removal from a high-profile case by hiding something so easily discoverable? Unless that person had a reason to be there. Now let's talk timing. The moment juror number 6 was dismissed, Diddy's legal team freaked out. And not just in a standard legal way. They launched into a full-blown campaign, demanding the juror be reinstated, claiming his removal was racially and culturally biased, and insisting that Diddy's chances at a fair trial were now ruined. But that reaction said more than they probably realized. Because what it really did was shine a spotlight on how invested Diddy's team was in this one particular juror. Not the jury as a whole, just this one man. They even argued in filings that this juror was uniquely aligned with Diddy in terms of race, culture, and socioeconomic status. That's not a request for impartiality, that's a request for favorability. And that raised a huge red flag in the courtroom, the press, and the public. Because now people weren't asking, why was juror number 6 removed? They were asking, why was he there in the first place? When the judge announced the removal of juror number 6, the reaction from Diddy's legal team wasn't just strong, it was immediate, intense, and strategic. Courtroom insiders say the defense barely let the judge finish before launching into a full-scale objection. They didn't take a beat to process. They didn't request a sidebar. They didn't ask for a clarification. They exploded, both in tone and in tactics. Their first move accused the prosecution of racial bias. They claimed that removing juror number 6, one of the only black men on the jury, was a form of modern-day exclusion. They argued that by striking this juror, the prosecution had disrupted the cultural balance of the jury and robbed Diddy of someone who could fairly understand and relate to his life story. On paper, it sounds like a civil rights argument. But here's the twist. There were still 2 other black male jurors in the pool. One already seated, one alternate. So the defense's claim wasn't about racial representation. It was about this specific juror, someone they said Diddy could relate to. And that's when the courtroom temperature really shifted, because the moment a defense team starts arguing that a defendant needs a juror who understands them or shares their cultural background, it stops sounding like a plea for fairness and starts sounding like a strategy for influence. Let's look at the actual language used in their letter to the court. Diddy's legal team said, "Juror number 6 shares similar life experiences with Mr. Combs, and his removal deprives our client of a juror who understands his perspective." That sounds almost reasonable until you read between the lines. They weren't asking for balance, they were asking for bias, the kind that benefits Diddy. And their panic over this one juror being removed, it wasn't just about optics, it was about losing control of the case. Because here's the truth no one in that courtroom could ignore. Diddy and his team were banking on that juror. Whether that means they expected him to push for acquittal, challenge other jurors behind closed doors, or even create a hung jury scenario, we may never know for sure. But the legal team's emotional unraveling told the story loud and clear. They lost a key player, a piece of their puzzle, a card they planned to play, and play hard. And once that card was off the table, they had no fallback. The mistrial motion came almost immediately after the juror's removal. That's not normal. You don't just file for a mistrial 30 minutes after a judge makes a decision unless you were already prepared to do it. That tells us something even deeper. Diddy's legal team knew this day might come. They had a plan, and when the judge made his move, they executed theirs. But it was sloppy, too fast, too emotional, and far too transparent. And this emotional spiral didn't just stop in the courtroom. Word is, behind the scenes, Diddy himself has been spiraling, furious at his legal team, frustrated by the judge's tone, and allegedly trying to reassert control over a trial that's slipping further away from him by the day. So now the public, the press, and most importantly, the prosecution are starting to ask the bigger question. If Diddy's team is this desperate to keep one specific juror in place, if they're willing to claim racial bias while ignoring the other black jurors, if they immediately pivot to demanding a mistrial before the dust has even settled, then what were they really trying to do with juror number 6? And if this juror was planted, or even just subtly encouraged to get on the jury, then we're no longer talking about defense strategy. We're talking about jury manipulation, and that, in federal court, is not just unethical, it's criminal. When Diddy's legal team lost juror number 6 and tried to spin it into a racial injustice narrative, it might have worked in the court of public opinion, but inside that courtroom, the judge was not buying it. Judge Aaron Subramanian didn't just deny the mistrial motion. He issued a carefully worded, but absolutely devastating statement that signaled to everyone watching, "I see through this." And it ends now. Here's what the judge said in response to the defense's outcry. Taking these all together, the record raises serious concerns as to the juror's candor and whether he shaded answers to get on and stay on the jury. Now, let's break that down. In legal terms, candor refers to honesty, transparency, and good faith. When someone's candor is in question, it doesn't always mean they lied outright. It means they may have twisted the truth just enough to deceive the court. The phrase shaded answers is incredibly important here. It's a surgical term, a soft way for a judge to say, you didn't tell the full truth because you wanted to hide something. This wasn't just a procedural issue. This was a trust issue. Judge Subramanian was saying, in no uncertain terms, that juror number 6's presence on the panel was tainted from the start, not because of race, not because of bias from the prosecution, but because of dishonesty during jury selection. And more importantly, he was implying that the dishonesty may not have come from the juror alone. That's when the courtroom went silent. Because while the judge didn't outright accuse Diddy's team of orchestrating a juror placement, his tone, his language, and the speed of his ruling suggested he suspected exactly that. This is the moment when the trial shifted. Up until this point, Diddy's legal team had tried to maintain a kind of moral superiority in court. They positioned themselves as defenders of justice, fighting for fairness against a supposedly biased system. They brought up civil rights, representation, media bias. They wrapped their strategy in social justice rhetoric. But Judge Subramanian stripped all of that away with a single paragraph. His statement told us three very important things. He believes juror number 6 misrepresented himself in order to remain on the panel. He does not believe Diddy's argument that this juror's removal was prejudicial or unfair. He will not allow courtroom theatrics or legal manipulation to derail the proceedings. And let's not forget, this isn't just any judge. Judge Subramanian is a federal judge with a reputation for being detail-oriented, measured, and not easily rattled. He doesn't use words like serious concerns lightly. So when he calls out a juror's shaded answers, he's not just protecting procedure. He's sending a clear warning, "You're not going to play games in my courtroom. I don't care who you are." And for Diddy, a man who has spent his entire adult life in full control of his brand, his businesses, and his environment, that's a nightmare. Because for the first time, someone has more power than he does, and that someone is now watching him very, very closely. What happens next is going to be crucial, not just for this trial, but for every other case Diddy is facing. Because if Judge Subramanian suspects even a whiff of jury tampering or strategic deception, this trial doesn't just become about the original charges, it becomes about interference with the justice system itself. And that, ironically, could be the very thing that finally puts Diddy on the wrong side of the law, for good. If you've been tracking Diddy's behavior since this legal saga began, one thing becomes clear. He never planned to win this trial the traditional way. From the moment he was indicted, it's looked less like a defense and more like a strategy to confuse, stall, distract, and disrupt the entire process. And now, in light of the juror number 6 scandal, it's impossible not to view it as part of a much larger pattern. Because this isn't the first time Diddy's legal team has tried to flip the chessboard when the game wasn't going their way. Let's run through the timeline. Not the official legal timeline, but the one that tells the real story. A billionaire mogul trying everything short of a disappearing act to escape accountability. It started with the bail package, and it was massive. One of Diddy's earliest moves was to try and buy his way out. He offered a bond package worth over $50 million. Not only that, he put up multiple luxury properties as collateral and even surrendered his own passport and his children's passports as proof he wouldn't flee. It was an extraordinary offer, but it was also extremely calculated. The goal wasn't just to get out of jail, it was to send a message. I have the resources to fight this from the outside. I just need the green light. But both the court and the prosecutors saw through it. They shut the request down twice. Why? Because this wasn't a shoplifting case or a first-time offense. This was a high-stakes trial involving serious allegations, and there were well-founded fears that Diddy might flee the country, use his money to suppress evidence, intimidate witnesses or victims. So the court sent its own message back. Money won't save you here. And that's when things started to get really messy. Then came the illegal search argument. Diddy's next move? Flip the narrative. His legal team claimed that a routine search conducted by jail officials, one that didn't even target Diddy directly, violated his rights. They argued that some of his private notes and legal materials had been seized unfairly, even though the court quickly clarified that Diddy wasn't the target of the search and that his materials had been returned. His legal team ran with it. They turned it into a civil liberties issue, claiming he was being harassed, that his due process rights were being trampled, that he was the victim of institutional overreach. But in reality, it was another delay tactic, another attempt to create confusion, another shot at building the case for a mistrial before the trial even began. The jury selection disruption, racial politics, or strategic interference. Then came jury selection, and that's where things started to look eerily familiar. Diddy's team claimed the prosecution was racially biased because they used their peremptory strikes to remove several black jurors from the pool. On paper, that's a serious accusation. The court has strict rules around discriminatory jury selection. It's illegal and unconstitutional. But when the judge examined the strikes, the prosecution had clear, race-neutral reasons for each one. Some had criminal records, others had law enforcement backgrounds. One was even a close friend of someone already involved in the case. None of that mattered to Diddy's lawyers. They weren't trying to ensure a fair process. They were trying to cast doubt on the process itself. It was all building towards something, a bigger goal. And that goal, we now know, was setting the stage for a mistrial, the juror strategy, the cherry on top of the chaos. And that brings us full circle, back to juror number 6, because now, when you look at how Diddy's legal team reacted to his removal, it makes perfect sense. This juror wasn't just one of many. He was part of the fail-safe, the just-in-case, the piece that could tip the scale if things went south, or maybe even manufacture a hung jury if the vote didn't go their way. But when the judge removed him, that piece was ripped off the board. And suddenly, all the motions, the civil rights claims, the emotional objections, they didn't look like real legal concerns anymore. They looked like part of the show. A strategy of confusion, not defense. The truth is, Diddy's legal team hasn't been defending him from the allegations. They've been trying to collapse the case from the inside. They've tried to weaponize identity politics, distract with procedural complaints, accuse the court of systemic bias, plant a potentially favorable juror, turn every setback into a violation, build a narrative that the entire system is out to get. Diddy, and yes, it's a strategy. A risky, aggressive, chaotic strategy. But it also suggests something important. They don't believe they can win this case on the merits. They don't think the facts are in their favor. They're not preparing for a strong closing argument. They're preparing for a collapse. A mistrial, a technicality, a loophole, because that at this point may be the only way out. With juror number 6 gone and their secret weapon off the board, Diddy's legal team didn't just take the hit quietly. They immediately filed a letter to the court, a formal, aggressive request for a mistrial. And when you read it, it's less a legal argument and more a meltdown disguised as emotion. Let's be clear, filing for a mistrial is no small thing. It's the courtroom equivalent of pulling the emergency brake. It doesn't just stop the trial, it wipes the slate clean and forces the state to either start over or drop the case. It's supposed to be used in rare, extreme situations, things like juror misconduct, explosive new evidence, or constitutional violations. But Diddy's lawyers, they're asking for a mistrial over everything. Their list of complaints reads less like a legal strategy and more like a frantic list of grievances. Here's what they're claiming. The trial shouldn't be happening. First, they argue that the entire case is illegitimate because the alleged victims, Cassie and Jane Doe, never reported Diddy to police at the time of the alleged incidents. This is a classic defense tactic. Why now? They want to plant seeds of doubt about the victims' credibility by pointing out that no formal complaints were made for years. But here's the flaw in that argument. Survivors of abuse, especially when the accused is powerful, often don't report right away. Why? Because of fear. Because of manipulation, because of shame. And in Diddy's case, allegedly because he had deep ties to law enforcement. So, the idea that silence equals consent, it's legally and morally outdated. The judge is unlikely to see that as grounds for a mistrial. Diddy's rights were violated in jail. Next, the motion claims that Diddy was subjected to unfair surveillance while in custody, that his notes were seized, that his communications were monitored, and that his privacy was breached. Let's remember, this isn't a guy in county lockup. This is a high-profile defendant facing multiple allegations, some of which include intimidation, coercion, and violence. The idea that jail officials would monitor someone like that isn't shocking. It's standard protocol. And the kicker? The court already confirmed that Diddy's notes were returned and that he was not the subject of the search in question. So once again, it's less about actual harm and more about creating the illusion of being mistreated. Prosecutors are creating a media circus. This part of the mistrial request might be the most ironic of all. Diddy's team claims the prosecution is turning the trial into a media spectacle, painting him as a monster in the eyes of the public. They argue that leaks, media coverage, and sensational headlines have made it impossible for Diddy to receive a fair trial. But let's be real, Diddy is a media spectacle all by himself. This is a man who has spent his entire life mastering headlines, manipulating narratives, and using press coverage to build power. And now that the spotlight isn't in his control, now that the headlines aren't flattering, suddenly the media is a problem. If anything, it looks like projection. Because let's not forget, Diddy's team has also leaked their own narrative to the press, painting him as a targeted black man, an industry scapegoat, a victim of government overreach. And now, with their chosen juror gone, they're scrambling to flip the story again. The court is biased, the process is rigged, the system is broken. This is the underlying tone of the entire motion. Diddy's team is no longer saying, "We can prove our client's innocence." They're saying, "The system is so unfair that this trial shouldn't even be allowed to continue." That's a massive shift, and it tells us something important. They're not trying to win anymore. They're trying to escape. Because legally, emotionally, and strategically, this team knows they're cornered. They've lost their leverage. They've lost their inside man. And they're watching a case they thought they could control slip out of their hands. Why this mistrial motion is unlikely to work. Now here's the big question. Will the judge grant it? Short answer, highly unlikely. For one, the court has already ruled on most of these issues. The judge has reviewed the surveillance complaint. He's weighed the jury selection accusations. He's ruled on the fairness of the process multiple times. More importantly, the judge just made a bold statement by removing juror number 6. That was an assertion of control, of authority, of confidence in the integrity of the trial. To now grant a mistrial based on the same arguments the court has already heard and rejected would undermine everything Judge Subramanian just did, unless something new and explosive emerges, like evidence that the prosecution deliberately sabotaged the defense. This motion is going nowhere. What this tells us about Diddy's state of mind. Here's the bottom line. This isn't just about legal strategy anymore. This is about panic. Diddy's team is throwing everything into this mistrial motion because it may be the last grenade they can throw before the verdict drops. They've moved past defense. They've moved past doubt. Now, they're trying to collapse the trial altogether because they know what's waiting for them at the end. And that's what makes this entire motion so revealing. It doesn't show the strength of their case. It shows their fear. Because if this trial continues, if the evidence is allowed to speak, if the jury reaches a verdict without interference, then Diddy's legal tricks, his courtroom theater, and his massive legal war chest might not save him at all. With everything that's gone down, the fake address, the secretive juror, the mistrial demands, and the courtroom outbursts, it's no longer just a trial. It's a reckoning. And at the center of it all is a man who spent 3 decades building an empire on power, control, and image. But now, that control is slipping, and the image is cracking. Let's be honest, Diddy isn't just another celebrity on trial. He's a symbol of an era, of hip-hop royalty, of wealth, charisma, and untouchability. He's someone who, for years, could move in silence, shut down allegations, and bury headlines before they ever made it to print. But this time, none of that worked. He couldn't buy a favorable judge. He couldn't charm the public. He couldn't keep the media quiet. And most importantly, he couldn't manipulate the jury. Because when juror number 6 was removed, something major was exposed. Diddy's legal strategy was never about proving innocence. It was about manufacturing doubt by any means necessary, creating distractions, planting loyalists, dragging out the process, whatever it took to avoid accountability. But with the judge now fully aware of what's been going on, the court is on high alert. And that changes the entire dynamic moving forward. So, where does this leave Diddy? Legally, he's in more danger now than ever before. He's lost his credibility with the court. He's shown signs of desperation. And if the judge or the prosecution finds even a shred of evidence that supports the growing theory of jury tampering, that's not just a mistrial. That's another criminal charge. Even worse, it would torpedo any future defense strategy in related cases. Because remember, this isn't the only investigation Diddy is facing. There are other accusers, other lawsuits, federal probes, civil suits, and if he's found to have tried to manipulate even one trial, it casts a shadow of guilt across all of them. And then there's the court of public opinion. Even if Diddy somehow skates on the legal technicalities, even if a mistrial is declared, even if he walks free from this case, his reputation may never recover. We're in a new era, one where silence is no longer safety, where survivors speak, where the internet remembers, where cultural power doesn't shield you, it shines a light on you. And what we're seeing now is a man who, for the first time in decades, isn't in control of the narrative. The leaks, the court documents, the removed juror, the desperation in every legal filing, it all paints the picture of someone fighting, not for justice, but for survival. What happens next? At this point, it's up to the judge. If he denies the mistrial motion, and he likely will, the trial continues. New witnesses take the stand. New evidence is introduced. And Diddy's team will have to fight the case on the merits, not on stunts. If the judge grants the motion, however unlikely, it'll spark outrage from both the media and the public, especially those who already believe Diddy has been playing this system like a game board. But either way, the truth is out. The tricks have been exposed. The public now knows what's going on behind the courtroom doors. Final thought, is Diddy still in control, or is the system catching up? For years, people whispered about what Diddy allegedly got away with. Industry insiders stayed silent. Victims stayed hidden. Lawsuits were buried. Stories got erased. But not anymore. Now the whispers are headlines. The silence is evidence. The shadows are under a spotlight. And Diddy is no longer the one calling the shots. So the question is no longer, will he win? The real question is, how much more is going to come out before it's over? And when it's finally all out in the open, will there be anything left of the man who once called himself untouchable? So what do you think? Is Diddy spiraling? Is this all one big setup? Or are we finally watching a powerful man face consequences for decades of silence? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more breakdowns like this.